Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our July 14th. We're going to move right into a discussion of right-of-way management cost recovery study. Mr. Brewer.
Morning, Mayor, members of Council. Jeb Brewer, City Engineer. This morning we'd like to present to Council the results of a recent study on the right-of-way management cost recovery. Just before we get into the presentation, I'd just like to outline our proposed schedule. Today is just an informational presentation to Council about the study. Depending upon Council's inclination, we'd like to go ahead and after this meeting, go ahead and send out letters and notices to all the stakeholders that would be involved with any kind of rate change due to this study. We would send out letters. We would also allow them to have a written comment period. We'd like to have a stakeholder meeting to invite them all to come in and provide comments. We would collate those, consolidate the comments, and then we wouldn't bring anything back to Council for Council's consideration until August 25th. Giving them time to look at the program, and implementation currently is being proposed in January of 2015. Just a little background on right-of-way management and the city. One of the city's single biggest asset is its right-of-ways. These are the areas in which streets and sidewalks and utilities occupy. It's very important. In fact, it's critical for the city's economic, social mobility. The city really would not exist if it didn't have adequate right-of-ways, and the city has a responsibility to manage those, not only for automobiles and bicyclists and pedestrians and transit, but also for the utilities that occupy those. Excuse me. The picture there you see is working downtown, and you can see there's a number of duct banks and utilities that we're having to work around to install a pipe, actually supporting them in the air and working underneath them. That kind of highlights the density and complexity of utilities, especially in the downtown area. Our right-of-ways contain anything from gas, electric, water, sanitary, storm, phone, cable, fiber optics, data communications, cell phones, and other uses. The city in 2003 initiated a right-of-way management program. It's primarily had been focused to manage the permitting, license, insurance, and bonding of those companies that were doing work in the right-of-way. They often do fairly disruptive work as far as patching, installing, operating, maintaining their facilities. We wanted to ensure that the contractors who were doing that work had the proper bonding and insurance in case anything happened, that they would protect the city. Just to give you a general idea of the scope of the amount of facilities in our right-of-ways, there is approximately 24 million equivalent linear feet of utilities within our right-of-way, representing billions of dollars of investment. Currently, our right-of-way management fee is, again, just focused on kind of a limited scope of making sure that those contractors that are working for those companies have proper bond and insurance. The goal of the cost recovery study was to determine what were the actual comprehensive costs to the city for managing the right-of-way and any kind of depreciation to city assets within the right-of-way. To determine what was the most fair and equitable way to distribute these costs across all users. And in order to do that, we hired Springstead company. Nick from the company is here this morning. If you do have some questions about the details of the study, it was a quite comprehensive study based upon a previous one the city had done that looks at actually overhead rate, labor, interviews, how the costs are incurred and how they're distributed. And they've had extensive knowledge not only with our system but other cities across the country. They've been involved with other similar right-of-way cost recovery programs, such as in St. Paul, Minnesota, Greensboro, North Carolina. Just as an example, St. Paul, Minnesota, their cost recovery program collects approximately $5 million a year in revenue. I'll get into the details a little bit, but the recommendations of the study came out that said that we should update our management cost recovery structure from what we currently have, and that we should base those cost recovery on the distribution of cost to the actual use of the right-of-way, and also recommended that out of the revenue would fund one additional city staff member to try to better manage these multiple users, provide better service to the public and to the utility users, and with the goal of reducing the cost not only to the city assets but also to the utility companies by having better coordination so that they can locate their facilities in areas that would be less disruptive to them and have less future impact for them in relocation and other impacts. The study looked at multiple years, but what I have here is a slide that shows an example year based upon fiscal year 12 data. These were the costs that were determined from the study that were the impacts due to this utilities of their installation, operation, and maintenance in the right-of-way. City incurred costs. These are costs that the city is already incurring. They're already in our budgets and our programs, and they're broken down into a number of different categories. When we talk about degradation cost, that's the impact to our streets and other facilities in the right-of-way. As you're probably noticed, especially this last year, there were a lot of water main breaks, but when there's any kind of utility work in the street, they have to take the street and they make a patch and they repair it. The problem is when that street is repaired, it's never as good as it was before it was repaired, and so it's depreciated. You can understand this if you have a car and it gets in an accident and you have to fix it. Well, when you sell it, someone wants to know if it's in an accident because the value isn't as great as if it had never been in an accident. Same way with our streets. So there was kind of a intricate looking at our streets and how well our streets, the age of our streets and the types of streets. The newer and better streets you have, you put a patch in it, there's a more impact. It's just like if you have a more expensive car and it gets in a wreck, it's a larger cost. As our streets, the streets that are not as in good a shape or older, there's a smaller impact due to that. So they had to look at the age of streets, and they came up in that all these costs do vary from year to year because it's based upon how much activity is in the right-of-way. And for 2012, it was $866,000 was the estimated depreciation and degradation to our facilities due to utility impacts. They also looked at construction costs. As you saw in the previous picture, whenever the city does construction projects within the right-of-way, they have to make accommodations for the utilities. There has to be planning. The contractor has to do phasing of his work. There are times that the utility work actually delays our construction contracts because the utilities have to get out of the way. We may have to provide additional right-of-way. There's all sorts of things that go into that, and the contractors have to include additional cost into their bids in order to do this. And you can see this if they build something out in a cornfield where they don't have to work around anything. It's much quicker. Time is money for contractors. And by looking at our right-of-way construction programs in 2012, the impact was over $6 million of additional construction cost. Again, that changes depending upon their program, how many projects that we would have in the right-of-way. Operational cost, those are costs result from city operations such as fire, police, public works, the other things that we have to do. If there's a water main break, the police are going to have to go out and close the street. There's going to be notifications and all those kind of things. Disruption cost, tried to capture those costs related to the lane and street closures associated with city operations. That disruption cost is only the cost associated with cities' operations being disrupted when garbage trucks have to reroute and they have to go longer ways around. As far as city impacts, for 2012 it was estimated that the citizens incurred about a $4 million impact as disruption, but just for city operations it was $45,000. And then there's another category of other costs. One of the major components of those is related to lost tree value for impacts to trees. Those costs are allocated primarily to those utilities, or actually exclusively to utilities that have overhead lines because they're the ones impacting the trees. Obviously, the underground utilities don't trim trees like the overhead. So that is an example for 2012. Just to see a picture or two of some of those. Talked about the degradation costs. This is just looking at example of patches in the street. You've probably seen more of those than you would care to see around the city, and obviously as our weather and freeze thaw, those patches, even though they try to do them as best as they can, they still oftentimes allow water to infiltrate into the road, which creates problems, future potholes. This is just an example when we're working on second, some of the trials and tribulations with working around utilities. That's a shoring box down in a trench, and it's full of water. And there was a water main nearby that broke, flooded it out, so the contractor has to pump that down, dry it out. It delays his operation and increases his costs. The next part of the study was how are these costs to be distributed fairly and equitably. Before we talk about that, just want to kind of look at users and group them. We have general right-of-way users, which is everybody that's in the right-of-way. They place it, can be anything from electric, phone, gas, telecommunications. But then we also have a group of users which we call integral users, and those are users such as our storm sewer. They're actually in the right-of-way, and their primary purpose is to ensure safe mobility of the public through the right-of-way, which is the primary purpose of the right-of-way. These integral users, as we'll find out later, really are exempt from having the cost recovery for them actually paying for the cost recovery. However, you still need to distribute the cost to them because because they're in the right-of-way, when you make distribution, you need to distribute it to all parties in there. And then we have franchise fee users, which are those users that are already paying or being charged a franchise fee, and they're exempt from any cost recovery because they're already paying a franchise fee. However, you still have to account for their cost and allocate those costs out. You can't take costs from one utility and transfer it to another. Again, the city is allowed by state law to recover costs incurred by managing the right-of-way. As I mentioned before, franchise users, they already pay a franchise fee, so they are exempt from any cost recovery. However, currently our non-franchise users pay only a small portion of the program management cost. Thus, that's the need to update our fee structure. The proposed changes, if you remember the other slide I showed where we had, for 2012, that we had showed about $9 million of impact to the city. If you look at that based upon our current fee structure and what the franchise fees use, about $4 million of that's already being recovered in a cost recovery from franchise fees. There's other city-to-city transfers like sanitary sewer, and then there's already the management fee, which we already charge of about $84,000, but that would have still left for 2012 a deficit of about $3.8 million that is not being collected, which is impacts due to these non-franchise utility users. So the idea is to try to propose a rate that we could recover that and make it equitable to all users, and it needs to represent the actual impacts from the size and displacement of the user's equipment in the right-of-way, and it needs to equally distribute the cost. It was based upon this concept of a total equivalent linear footage, which represents the usage and the impacts to the right-of-way from those users, and it was used to calculate an average rate, even though each year it changes. The average rate for the study was determined to be 35 cents per equivalent linear foot of equipment. As a reference, currently our fee structure is less than 1 cent. So it's 35 cents is what our cost recovery is saying would be an average, and we're currently collecting just under 1 cent per equivalent linear foot. In the proposal, our proposal would be to set the rate by council ordinance at 15 cents equivalent linear foot. You notice that's less than half of what's been calculated under the study. There are a couple of reasons that we would recommend actually setting the rate lower than that. One of them is that this fee study needs to be reaccomplished at least every 5 years and looked at annually. As I mentioned, this is based on actual impacts, and our actual impacts will vary depending upon if it's a really bad winter, there's lots of intrusions, so we would have more degradation cost. If our capital program happens to not be smaller one year, then there'd be less construction costs, so that cost goes up and down. If we set it less than half, then we would be assured that we would never overcharge because we would be significantly lower than what's calculated as the average. And we're also suggesting that it be phased in over a number of years because this will have an impact on these users, and we want to be conscious of their budgeting process and try to make sure that the fee is implemented in a reasonable manner that they can make plans in their budgeting. If the proposal is accepted and we do implement a new cost recovery fee structure, obviously that's cost savings to the city because we are already incurring these costs and we will continue to incur these costs. By adding additional staff, we're hoping to also reduce the cost to the utilities by having better coordination and less delay. Some of the activities that we would be able to perform, for example, when Wellmark came in and they wanted to relocate, they wanted to build a line from their downtown facility out to Altoona. We spent quite a bit of time, what you might think of as like a pre-application, and we looked at their routes and we tried to suggest routes that would be safer from future projects to say, hey, we're planning to do some projects here. If you put your facilities here, you're going to have to relocate them in a couple of years. There were also some things as far as working with regulatory agencies, the Corps, and here's some levies, there's places we don't want you to go. By having additional staff, we'd be able to do more of that work, and in the long term, it saves utilities companies money because a single relocation can cost them millions of dollars depending on what their facilities are. As I mentioned, we have our proposal would be a 5-year implementation plan. We would start out the first year having the rate set at 3 cents per equivalent linear footage and then increasing by 3 cents each year until the 5th year that it would come up to a total of 15 cents. The proposed changes would replace the existing fees. I mentioned the current fee right now is just under 1 cent. This wouldn't be on top of it. It replaces it because it's comprehensive and it looked at all the costs. I do have a handout here which lists all the companies that would be impacted. They're in alphabetical order. If you look at the handout, there's 4 columns there. The first column is just the equivalent linear footage, which is just a representation of how much equipment they have in the right-of-way. The second column of numbers is the current fee that they're paying under the current ordinance. So if you look at line 1, American Republic Insurance Company, they're paying $100. There's a minimum fee for processing for permit insurance. So if you look, then the third column is what would be proposed for year 1, and then the last column is what would be proposed for year 5. So again, American Republic, it doesn't change because they have very few facilities and they basically are at the minimum charge. The current code has a minimum charge of $100. The proposed changes would continue to do that. If you look down, you see some of the other entities. A few of them are very modest. There are some that are very significant increases. What does that mean as a total impact for cost recovery on the city of Des Moines? This chart just outlines what would be potential if City Council decides to move ahead with this new cost recovery system. Each year, there would be an increase in the fee, so there'd be an increase in the revenue. That's a range. First year would be $100,000 to $300,000 additional new cost recovery. Again, these are costs that the city has already incurred, but these would be revenues to help offset those costs that we're currently incurring. By year 5, that's anywhere between $850,000 and $1.4 million annually. That's every year. It's not a single revenue stream, but it's an ongoing annual. Again, just to outline the proposed schedule, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if council desires us to continue this, after this meeting, we would go ahead and send notices to all those companies that would be impacted. We would give them an opportunity to provide written input. We would also hold a stakeholder meeting on August 4th so they could come and present any issues, suggestions, changes, complaints they have with the program, and then we would consolidate those and bring them back to council on August 25th for the first reading of the ordinance. This would take an ordinance change And again, our recommendation is not to have the implementation occur until January of 2015. So that concludes my presentation. Does council have any questions, concerns?
Any
comments?
questions, anybody? Skip and then Christine.
Under costs incurred by the city, you've got $818,000, which includes the study and lost tree value. What was the cost of the study?
$56,000.
$56,000? So the remainder is lost tree value.
Yeah, and just to, it's maybe a little bit of sore subject, but if you remember previously when we had, we were trying to advocate for lost tree value and the franchise fee, that the courts did not uphold what we felt was. However, this study and the methodology is compliant with the Iowa Supreme Court ruling. So the number that was used for the trees was the number that was allowed by the Iowa Supreme Court. May not be the number that we feel, but it is one that's defendable and has been through that process.
Okay, and the reason our major power provider isn't on here is because they're already a franchise.
They're a franchise fee
Okay.
payer, so they're already contributing to that cost recovery, so they would not be impacted at all by this
Okay.
fee recovery because they're already paying the franchise fee.
Thank you.
So who are the others that are paying the franchise fee then currently, besides Mid-American?
Mid-American Gas, Electric, and then MediaCom.
Those are the only ones, the only
Only
other?
ones.
Okay, okay. And then, I thought you said at the beginning, Jeb, that you had some preliminary meetings or discussions with stakeholders?
Not on this particular program. We did, when we sent out the annual bill, we did put in a letter to say we are doing a study, and just to let them know, but we haven't actually provided officially any of these numbers. We wanted to wait until after council had a chance to hear it. We would be sending them out like tomorrow, the next day, if council wants us to go
So
forward.
when you send out the letter to invite them to the stakeholder meeting, will it have,
We will tell them our proposed amount.
okay, so they'll be able to quickly calculate then? I'm looking at some of the big ones, I'm
Right. And some of them, they're like, okay,
a
like.
little bit nervous about
Yeah.
this and some of the other ongoing discussions we're having, and how that will be viewed.
I'll be happy to share that with you later.
Okay.
And most of these will probably be passed on to the customer, don't you think, on a bill from either CenturyLink or Des Moines Water Works, or, I mean, they're,
That's
They're not
true.
going to absorb it, I'll tell you that.
no.
When we look at this, the cost is to the general public. Right now, the general public is actually paying for these costs, either through property tax.
Right.
So the idea is there is no free lunch. Somebody has to pay for these impacts. The idea is to make it as fair and equitable. That one of the things that you run into, obviously, is that these companies, for whatever purposes they're doing, may be serving companies and entities that are not directly in the city of Des Moines. There may be entities that don't pay property taxes that are taking advantage of the right-of-way and deriving benefit. So the idea is to try to make it a little more fair and equitable. But there's no free lunch. If the companies don't pay for them, our property tax payers are paying for them through the cost of street repairs and all the other impacts.
The one observation I would have, but based upon the significant increase by a couple of these on here, I'm guessing that you're going to hit it right in the middle of their fiscal year.
That was one of the reasons that we would try to phase it in, so the first year wouldn't be as a big an impact. If we implement it in the January 1st, we're hoping that gives them some time.
But if they're on a fiscal year of starting July 1st, you're going to hit them with the last 6 months of their fiscal year, and they've already certified budgets.
Yeah, one of the things, though, is that that would be an increase, but they wouldn't be paying this year's fee, so they've already had to budget this year's fee, but it would be, for some of them, it would be a significant, tens of thousands of dollars of increase.
Yeah.
So.
I'm just bringing that because I know how the
It's-
city would
it's difficult.
respond.
Right, that's why that was our concept of phasing it in. We didn't want to wait like a year and a half to implement it, but that is something we could do. I mean, this is.
I guess I'm thinking that I know you're sensitive to that, but I'm thinking maybe it's not enough time, that we should be looking at July 1st of 2015 as opposed to January.
And that would be easy enough to do when we come back with the ordinance, if that's the council's desire to wait until July 1st. If we do that, we may want to, we were hoping that we would not charge the current rate. We'd have to make a decision. We could do something like prorate the current rate for this year, but if we want to wait longer to implement it, it's really council's option on how to do that. But yeah, it is a concern. That was one of the reasons we had this phase in, because any entity just can't absorb something immediately without.
Well, last question. So this was a study done, and you've got the 5-year plan here. So is the expectation that you would do another study at the end of the 5 years, or?
There would be the expectation that there would be more comprehensive study every 5 years. Every year, we would need to look at the assumptions that were made in the study to see if there were any dramatic changes. For instance, if we had 0 capital improvements for a year, that's a major assumption. The capital program is a big portion of that. We would then have to make some adjustments, and the fee would have to be adjusted. Since it's a cost recovery fee, it has to represent the actual cost incurred by the city. So there would be it's set up that there's some tables and where those costs come out of our financial system. One of the problems is we're transferring from PeopleSoft to Munis, so that will make it a little more difficult. We may have to, like, after we get on Munis, do kind of an intermediate update so that we can actually identify those budget fields and then check those against our assumptions. But basically, every 5 years would be a major reevaluation. Every year would be at least a check in on our assumptions. And that would be done by city staff every year. Our goal is to set it up.
Got a question from Bob.
Yeah, going back to Christine, I think that you probably are going to have half a dozen a year, calendar year, and a half dozen fiscal year. I don't know how the big ones are here, how they do, but looking at the first year, the big ones are pretty big, good-sized companies, and I don't think it would affect their their budget materially.
Bill?
Jeb, there must be other municipalities that are following this program. Do you have some examples?
As I mentioned before, St. Paul, they have a similar one, and they collect about $5 million a year in a cost recovery mode, which is, I understand, about half about what they calculated was their impacts. They're collecting about half of that. So similar, what we're doing, we're suggesting collecting about half of what we calculate as the impact.
Anything closer around here, to your knowledge?
Some cities are considering it, but I'm not aware of any that are currently doing it.
Okay.
None in the state of Iowa at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
That was Nick.
Hey, Mayor and Council, a couple of comments. This has been flagged to you and to the people that would be affected. Actually, several years ago in 2003, when we first started a right-of-way management program, and it was small. But this is similar to that program. In Larry's simple world of budgeting, the city levies a tax for all of our needs. And we could have it so that building permits are free. It's just part of the taxes you pay. Years and years ago, no, that's not the way we do it. We do it with the users pay that, and the tax rate is for the general things that we all gain. This is really a way to even further identify the users, which we've done with the study. And I must recognize Jennifer and Jennifer, the consultant, Jeb, Mr. Lester, and his staff. They've really put their heads together for about 2 years thinking this through. But this really changes and puts a little more emphasis on users paying for the things that they're doing, because the general taxpayer has been subsidizing the people that have used our right-of-way. The one thing that links our community together is right-of-ways. That's it. We've got private property, we've got all the things we do zoning-wise, but the thing that links us together is the right-of-way, and having it work for everybody is really important. One of the things that Jeb mentioned was adding staff. Mr. Moore came in with an issue just a few blocks east of here last week, and it was construction that was taking place in a right-of-way and the impact it was having on the businesses. If we have enough staff, we can probably do better noticing, better management of those kind of things. That was the parking issue that you brought up, where we had to close parking because of construction. So that's, it's important to recognize that with this, we'd be increasing some of the management of how the right-of-way is used and coordination with that additional staff. But more important, it is taking the burden off the general taxpayer, subsidizing, if you will, the people that use the right-of-way. Ms. Hensley pointed out one of the things that we wrestled with, which was how to stage it in. And I remember not too long ago when the state changed some law and we had to jump and change our budgets really quick, and we're sensitive to that. I think one of the things we'll find out when Jeb does his stakeholder meetings is what are the sensitivities? Because you can set this higher, lower, change the timing, however you want to do it. But we did our best to give a recommendation to start from and then make the adjustments to make it reasonable to get implemented. But it really is an important way, a new revenue source within what we have and can do that you've been talking about for years. So I thank the consultant and the team that brought this forward, because this will have quite an impact and take some of the burden off the general taxpayer and put it back to the user of our right-of-ways.
Chris?
A couple more questions now. So has any of this been incorporated into our existing budget at this point? And so,
No.
Okay, so,
No.
no. Okay.
It has not. We did flag it during the budget work community meetings that we were looking at some revenue items for the next year and years out, and this was one of them. But no, we're not counting on this, but it sure would be good to get this identified, implemented, so the companies know about it, so we can move forward and include this in our budgeting.
So the additional staff has not been
It
identified
has
either?
not.
No.
It is not. Because the additional staff is really part and parcel of increasing our service, helping justify why we're doing this. And frankly, that staff person will be doing a lot of the work, as Jeb mentioned. We got to keep this in check every year with the ups and downs of construction or whatever else. And they'll be helping with some of that analysis.
Bill?
Jeb, looking through this list, a lot of recognizable names here. How did you get this list put together, and are we sure that we can identify all of the users out there? I mean, it might be some renegades out there,
I'm sure they're renegades.
There may be
out there.
some renegades out there, and of course, we don't know what we don't know. So we've had this program since 2003, so these are people who are currently in the program that we've identified and asked people to identify. It is possible that people have facilities out there that they shouldn't, they're not permitted. How do we find those out? Well, I guess with a backhoe, and then we're like, hey, you weren't supposed to be here. But yeah, I don't know if there are renegades. They're probably smaller entities. I mean, you notice there's some very small ones in here that we try. But I think for the most part, it's been around for over a decade. I think people realize that when they come in. And if we see somebody out there working, it's like, hey, where's your permit? Oh, I don't have one. Yeah, you need to come in. That has happened. And you need to come in. This is the process, and you need to get a bond and insurance and things like that.
Yeah, so it's the permit process is how we identify them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Good discussion, Jeb. Let's continue seeing how it goes. You're going to,
So our next step would be to send letters out to all these users
Right.
with their identification and setting up this workshop or stakeholders meeting on August 4th, so.
okay. All right.
Perhaps if I could just add one thing. I don't want you to believe that this is something.
For the record, could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Nick Dragisich with Springstead, the consultant on the study. And I didn't want to mislead you on the question of what other cities are doing. Jeb pointed out St. Paul, but other cities that charge their own utilities or occupants of the right-of-way a fee. National Davidson County has a fairly sophisticated system. They base it on cubic feet occupied to take into account that poles go up in the air. Virginia Beach, Greensboro, as Jeb pointed out before. And the last city I worked at, Spokane, Washington, we charge our own utilities 18% of gross revenues for being in the right-of-way. People have different ways of approaching it, but the concept of recovering the costs is fairly well established across the United States. So you're not breaking new trail. I think Iowa's where it's at because of the litigation and the Supreme Court rulings that have ensued. I am working with some cities in Iowa, I can't say right now, on a similar system. But I think you're going to see more of it because folks are looking to allocate costs where costs are being incurred. So I didn't want to just leave it hanging that St. Paul was the only one out there and have you thinking you're breaking ground that hasn't been walked over before.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, with that, let's move on to our next item, update on economic development.
Good morning, Mayor, County members of City Council. Matt Anderson, Assistant City Manager. We bring forward some pretty big economic development projects to you. They get a lot of attention at the council level and a lot of media attention. And then oftentimes these large projects kind of disappear for a few months while we work through the details. And you probably are wondering, what are you up to? And we think the public might be too. So we thought this would be a good opportunity just to bring you up to speed on about a half a dozen projects that are working through our system. It's a lot of work when we get these big ones, complicated projects that have, I think a couple we're working on with 6 or 7 affected departments and staff that are working on details. So there's a lot going on right now behind the scenes quietly. So I'll start with the NAP and Hy-Vee proposal on Court Avenue. We've been working through design issues with them, trying to get the project as dense as we possibly can, trying to figure out if they'll be parking underground, what do the economics look like. We're really happy with the way the store itself is lining up, the way the apartment density is working out and trying to get more density wrapped down 4th Street. Where we started scratching our head and wondering if we were in the right direction was on the public parking component of it. And we took Jennifer's model that we had done a couple years ago, which we now own that model. It's a sophisticated computer model, and you can start to plug in some supply and demand. And as we started to look at the court space and then the 5th and Walnut garage, which needs to come down soon, we were getting concerned that we were maybe putting our supply in the wrong location to match demand, and that we were maybe going to end up with a supply in 2 locations, 5th and Walnut and on the Hy-Vee Court Avenue site, which would have raised our expenses. So we've gone back to NAP and asked them to look at redesigning that site without public parking as part of it. Remove the city parking garage out of there and let's us focus on putting that parking on the 5th and Walnut site as part of a new development. That does a couple things for us. It's going to help us financially, and it's going to help us with density on the NAPS on the Hy-Vee site, so we can get more housing on that site, wrap around 4th Street better. That garage was taking up a lot of room. The circulation of that garage was taking up a lot of room, and it was becoming kind of expensive. We don't have a new plan back from NAP, so we hope to be working with them and their architects this month, bring something back to the neighborhood groups and the stakeholders on Court Avenue who've had a real interest in this. The store itself hasn't changed. It's still at its 30 to 35,000 square foot. But we're getting more housing, more market rate housing on the site, which will help the financing. So we'll bring that back to you as we move forward, and kind of on a parallel track, economic development staff and myself will be drafting an RFP for the, or an RFQ, we haven't figured out the exact process, for the 5th and Walnut parking garage site. We envision a mixed-use development there, something similar to, in scale, maybe to like the Davis Brown Tower, where you have some street-level retail. In that instance, it's private parking or privately owned parking, but open to the public. Privately owned parking in the middle, and then another use up above. We kind of see the same kind of layer cake of uses, don't know exactly what they'll be, how the parking ownership would work out, but we're going to work with Jennifer, figure out exactly what that parking number should be, and then also work with NAP to see, you know, it's that Hy-Vee parking, how is it used? Is it open to the public at all, maybe later in the evenings? How does the resident parking get taken care of, the employee parking for Hy-Vee? So a lot of moving parts on that, but it's definitely moving forward. I think Hy-Vee all along was planning that this would be a spring start. Not by the time they got through legal and financing and designed the project, a winter start probably wasn't a good idea. So we're looking at a spring start for that. So we'll be bringing that contract back and the details back through the neighborhood and through you in the coming months. Another parking component project, 7th and Grand. If you recall, the City Council selected a team of Opus and Sherman to develop that garage. We're working on that. One piece that looks like it might be falling out is the hotel. Financially, we're having a real hard time getting the numbers to work on the hotel that could go above that parking garage, but the gap isn't narrowing enough that we can close it. So we'll be making a decision by the end of the month on that, whether we can make that work or not. Doesn't doesn't stop the garage component or the housing component, but at some point you have to look at it and you're kind of putting a square peg in a round hole, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Can you elaborate on the
Yes.
housing? I know George Sherman was the individual they identified for the housing component.
Still a part of the team.
So is that market rate?
Market rate, yes. High-end, very high-end market rate, probably pushing the highest end of the rental market to date in Des Moines. So based on amenity level and service package that they would deliver. So we have a big team of city legal and finance that's working on trying to figure out the best financial structure for that garage. The parking system, as you know, is limited on bonding capability, so this is going to be a tough one to do, but we know we have to do it. The AC Hotel, this is Heart of America, Mike Whalen's hotel in the East Village. We have, our legal department has drafted the first draft of the development agreement. That's gone to the developer, come back to us with minor revisions, and we're going to go back to them with the revisions later this week. They've had their phase 1 environmental study completed. You'll probably see them out there later this week drilling holes for a phase 2 environmental study. So that's moving forward just like we had expected. Things are going well. The Come and Go project, you may have read that they're continuing to acquire land in Western Gateway Park west of Wellmark. That's ongoing. Their next step in their process is to select an architect. They're interviewing architects right now. They're looking for a very prominent architectural firm to bring into town to kind of design an iconic building in the Western Gateway, so we're looking forward to working with them. So just continuing our dialogue with them. The ball's really in their court. They've had a very large incentive package approved by the state of Iowa for their job retention and growth, and as soon as we have more details out of them when they get their architect selected, we'll sit down with our planning staff and work with that architectural firm on placement of the building, parking, and circulation, and that sort of thing.
Matt, they
Yes.
have had several meetings with neighborhoods up in
Yes.
Sherman Hill.
Yes.
I mean, they've been really reaching out, trying to have discussions.
Yes, they're very active. They've been a great team to work with. The Event Center Hotel, late in June, we had a great announcement that the state of Iowa had approved $36.5 million in Iowa reinvestment funds for the project. So there was a meeting last week, and there's another meeting coming up next week. We've got a lot of finance meetings with the county, Mortensen, and the city to try to figure out how we're going to plug the rest of the gap. So we have a financial subcommittee formed of some of the brightest people that know how to get this stuff done, and we'll be bringing. We have until I believe it's March to bring back the final proposal to the state. Their award, their $36 million award, was a preliminary award. It's up to $36 million. So we got to prove up things on our end with the developer and the city and county, put together the rest of that financial package. We'll be bringing it back to you as we know the details. I don't know. There's so many moving pieces in this. We've had meetings where people say, well, just tell me what the gap is. And you can't really tell you a single number because there's so many floating pieces in this, and it's going to end up being probably the most complicated financial structure we've brought to you. And so we're going to bring it to you and to the public in manageable kind of bite-sized pieces and try and put it into layman's terms as best we can. I'm learning as we go. This one's something that we can get done, but it's going to take a heavy lift from city, county, and some of our partners too, from the business community, the CVB, Global Spectrum, who manages the event center. So we're going to bring all parties in to try to fill this gap. And last but not least, the Yonkers building. It's a really interesting demolition that Jeb and Phil could tell you a lot about if you want to corner them and talk about it. It's you'd think that demolition is just a matter of hitting it with something big and knocking everything in the hole, but it's absolutely not. It's a very engineered and detailed demolition. Hand tools and handwork going on at the top courses of that brickwork so that more property damage or is not done. So the good news, tenants are back in the hub tower. They were displaced for probably up to 3 months due to the risk of those walls falling, but the tenants are back in the hub tower. The skywalk shoring for the city-owned skywalk bridges is almost done. The demo is underway on the Yonkers building on the east block. All the walls will come down, and that's about a 4-month process to get that demolition completed. So you can even picture this. You're going to be working in the winter, cleaning up that site still. One important piece is next steps. What do you do with the west building and the tea room, and what do you do with the block that's left on the east block? If you recall, this project had CDBG DR funds in it, and the state is looking for the developer to make a decision on what they're going to do with those funds really by the end of this month, but certainly by August. when this next round of CDBG-DR comes out, when you'll be asked to make a recommendation to the IEDA board, I think at your August 20th, your second meeting in August. By that time, the state needs to know what is the Alexander Company going to do with that existing allocation that they have on the Yonkers building. This is the last round of CDBG-DR funds, and so the state doesn't want Alexander Company deciding sometime next year that they don't want to use the funds and they throw them back to the state. The state's not going to do another round of allocation to get rid of those funds. So they need a decision right now to know if they want to throw those $3 million into the current pot and get them allocated in this round. So we'll be working with Alexander Company. Alexander Company's aware of that. We'll be working with them on what they want to do with that west block. All indications right now are that they would save the west building, rehab it into approximately 60 apartments and commercial space similar to what they would have done before, but it will stand alone as just that half building. The tea room is in that building and could be salvaged as part of that effort also. So we'll work with the Alexander Company on what those next steps are. The big question is what's the next step on the east block? Alexander typically is not a ground-up developer. They're an historic rehab developer. That's the bulk of their business. And I don't know at this point if they have an appetite or a desire to tackle a project on that block, or if it would become a block that they would open up for sale for another development, or include DMR, Des Moines Redevelopment Company in it maybe as a land bank to hold the land, or exactly what we do. So there's a lot of options on the table. It's certainly a critical block, particularly as we go through the revitalization of Walnut Street, and it's got a lot of potential. You're surrounded on all three corners by 20-story buildings, and it's a very prominent downtown block that deserves a lot of attention. It also, redevelopment of that block is crucial because of the skywalk linkages. We've got to get that. We've got to at least get a plan for a plan in place, so we know what we're going to do with that skywalk corridor. And do we do something temporary, kind of a makeshift, so we can get that corridor open, or if there's an imminent plan in place, then we can work with that over that timeline. So that was a lot, and if you have further questions on these or any other projects, absolutely feel free to stop by my office or shoot me an email, and I can bring you up to speed. Yes, Mr. Moore.
Do you have an update on Eastgate?
I think the update is there is no update. Not a lot of movement. We've engaged Grandview. Doesn't seem to be a whole lot of possibilities there, but we'll continue to do that. To answer your question, at least through my office, there's been no private interest. I don't believe that the developer has had many inquiries over the course of this year. And aside from the come and go, no activity on Eastgate.
And come and go's not going forward, are they? I mean, they just planted grass where that, looks like it's not going forward.
I'll follow up.
I haven't heard anything lately on it.
Me either.
Well, it's gone to grass. They actually planted grass.
Well, we've got an area of the city that just continues to deteriorate out there. I think it's time we start to concentrate on that intersection out there and see what we can make happen. Seems like we're making things happen in other areas of the city, but not out there.
Okay.
Go.
Matt, one other thing, has any resolution been come to on whose insurance is going to pay the liability?
No, the insurance discussions have not taken place, and I would look to Scott to answer that question. No, the insurance issues are probably going to be ongoing for a long period of time. We obviously are responsible for the skywalk bridges, and then the bigger issue will be whose responsibility is it for the damage to the surrounding buildings. And no, there's no resolution on that, and I think it'll be quite some time until that does happen.
Jeff?
Just Jeff Brewer, city engineer. We have been in contact with our carrier for the liability, not the liability, but the comprehensive insurance. And we've been given the estimates, the money that we sent. They've sent out their adjusters. There's going to be some meeting probably in a week or so, so we'll kind of figure out what the city's going to get for our piece of the skywalk. The bigger question is all the other entities out there, which, we don't have a direct involvement with it, but we have been working with our insurance carrier to recover what obviously we're entitled to under that policy.
Joe?
What about Fort Des Moines, the Doyles? Where are we at with
Doyle's are continuing to work on their financing. They struggled at first. The appraisals weren't coming in where they needed them to be for financing, so they're going back and looking at it. It's an ongoing project that we feel confident will happen. Doyle's are a great team,
Yeah.
and it's a great property. It's just taking a little longer than we thought it would, but it looks favorable.
Okay.
Christine?
The Register Building,
Yes.
where's it at? I mean, I met with the developers, but I haven't heard anything since.
They're working on their financing also. I do not believe that they're going to come in and apply for the CDBG DR round. I believe that they're looking at potentially a 4% bond deal on the site. They want to get started as soon as possible. Didn't want to wait for the CDBG DR. Thought it was going to be too drawn out because the state's not going to make their decision until the end of the year. And then even then, it's a competitive process. They weren't sure if they would get it or not. So to keep the project moving, I believe they're looking to do a bond project.
Okay, thank you.
Bob?
Matt, EMC's all back and everything's going well at EMC?
Yes, everything's going well at EMC. They had on some of their lower floors, they had vacated kind of the north bay of offices or conference space, and they've just begun moving people back into those. They were waiting for us to get our Skywalk Bridge shored up, and now that that's wrapping up, they're getting people back. EMC really only had I think they had one day, that Monday, that they were out of their offices and had people working from home, and I believe everybody was back in Tuesday. They just pulled everybody back away from that north face in case there was any further damage, and plus they had a lot of window work to do on that north face also. Same with the Hub Tower. Hub Tower, they vacated those west offices and moved everybody central to the building so they could, number one, to eliminate the risk of debris falling and to get access to the windows. EMC has their windows on order. They're being fabricated. I think the Hub Tower ones come in at the end of the summer. EMC building will come in later in the fall. So you'll still see a lot of construction going on down there.
Thank you.
Anything else? Mr. Manager, anything?
No, sir.
All right, why don't we, Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Appreciate the update. And also, all the staff for your hard work on all these various projects and presentations this morning. That right away is going to be interesting to see how that's received. Let's open it up for public comment. Anybody? Seeing no one, we will have a city council meeting this evening. So for those of you who are so inclined, we'll see you a little later, start about 4:30. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.